Good evening, everybody. I'm Nick Burns, professor at the Kennedy School. On behalf of my co-chairs, Professor Jim Sebanius of Harvard Business School, Professor Bob Mnookin of Harvard Law School, we want to welcome you to Harvard's tribute to Secretary of State James A. Baker III. Please give him a warm welcome. You are all distinguished guests, of course, but I do want to single out three very distinguished friends of Harvard who are visiting from Kuwait, beginning with His Excellency Dr. Mohammed al-Sabah, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of the State of Kuwait, who is seated right in front of me. And His Excellency Ambassador Salam al-Sabah, who is the Ambassador of the State of Kuwait to the United States of America. And Dr. Adnan Shihab El-Din, who is the Director General of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science. The Kennedy School has had a project over the last decade with the Kuwait Foundation that's been of extraordinary benefit to our university. And we hope to the Kuwait Foundation as well, so we thank all of them for being here. What we're doing today is celebrating a great negotiator, James A. Baker III. I would say this about him as a former career diplomat, and I had the chance as a very junior person to observe him and work for him when he was Secretary of State. I think he's certainly the most consequential Secretary of State that we've had in this country in at least 4 decades. How could it be otherwise? When we think about what he talked to our students, hundreds of them, from all across this university this afternoon, because he was the principal figure in the unification of Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. And not many people would have made a bet on November 10th, 89, that by September 1990, Germany would be unified in NATO. And I would say, along with the opening to China that President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger negotiated 40 years ago this winter, the unification of Germany, along with the opening to China, is the signature achievement of American diplomacy in the last 4 decades. We talked about that. We talked about the liberation of Kuwait today. And we focused on it as a matter of a case study. And the coalition that Secretary Baker was able to arrange under President George H.W. Bush's leadership, that united the entire world against Saddam Hussein. And we noted today, and this is supremely ironic, including 2 divisions of forces sent by President Hafez al-Assad of Syria. Supremely ironic to reflect on that, considering the events of this day. And we also talked about the fact that following the victory in the Gulf War and the liberation of Kuwait, Secretary Baker led the negotiations to begin the modern Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, the Madrid process. What he was able to do today for all of our students from all across the university was to give the kind of insights that professors can't give. And we'll make use of this by videos and case studies at the business school, law school, and the Kennedy School, so that students in years to come will be able to hear him speak about what he was thinking, about his strategic vision, about his tactics. I say this as well about Secretary Baker. He is a unique public servant. And I don't think we've had anyone in my lifetime with quite his record. Consider this. He was Undersecretary of Commerce for President Ford. He has managed 5 presidential campaigns. No one else in American history has managed 5 presidential campaigns. He was, of course, Chief of Staff to President Reagan at a very successful time for our country. He was Secretary of the Treasury for President Reagan, and he was our Secretary of State. It's an extraordinary record of public service for a university that prizes public service. And I would just say very personally, I had the chance to observe him. I was usually the person down at the very end of the table taking notes in these meetings 20 years ago. He's the most effective person I ever saw in government, and certainly the most outstanding negotiator for all of us in the Project on Negotiation who value that we have produced in the United States of America. So we are really honored to have him here today. And I think our students benefited from the 3 hours that they spent with him. And what we'll do tonight is we'll all have dinner, and then Secretary Baker will be given the Great Negotiator Award by our university, by Professor Mnookin. Secretary Baker has some thoughts. He has a speech to give. You'll have a chance to ask him some questions, and then Professor Jim Sebanius will conclude the evening. But we're delighted to have all of you here today. Mr. Secretary, it's been a great day. Thank you for coming to Cambridge.
Does the Future of Diplomacy project and the program on negotiation, I feel he has done such remarkable things in terms of public service for our nation, but also because James A. Baker III is a great lawyer. I think, among other things, he has what I would characterize as contextual wisdom. He is someone who this afternoon described to us in the three things we studied. How, in both a strategic way, with an eye on the big picture, and a tactical way, he was able to help guide our country through some very, what can only be regarded as terrific challenges. We all learned so much this afternoon, and among other things, I'm going to quiz, if there is anyone here, who can tell me and remind us all of something that every great negotiator should know about the 5 Ps. Because we haven't had dessert yet, I didn't want to say 6, but and that is the extraordinary importance of preparation. And I think that Secretary Baker is a great negotiator for many, many reasons. He is, in the words of Nick Burns, he was always the best prepared in the room. He had always thought through what his goals and interests were, but he also had the capacity. Preparing for a negotiation is not like asking for directions from Google Maps, where you're going to necessarily know, go 3 blocks and then turn right for 2 blocks and then go left, because it's interactive. And his capacity in the face of challenges to adapt was just extraordinary. So before I'm reduced to whisper, what I want to do is, if I could, on behalf of our 2 projects and programs, to offer this to you. It's a small token. It's a silver dish.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much.
It's a Paul Revere bowl. And without more to do, I'd like to turn it over to Secretary.
Thank you. You take that. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Bob and Nick and Jim, for this award, of which I'm very proud and happy to receive it. I'm delighted to be up here at Harvard. I want to begin by acknowledging our good friends from Kuwait, Minister, Ambassador, Dr. Adnan. We're delighted that you're here with us, and it's a real pleasure for me to see you again. We worked together, ladies and gentlemen, over the course of a number of years, and it's a real delight to have you here. Nick told you that I ran 5 presidential campaigns. He didn't tell you how they turned out. I sure as hell didn't win them all. But I need to begin by telling you, I really never intended to get into politics or public service in my life. I was a lawyer in Houston, Texas, and I had a grandfather who was very prominent in our family law firm down there. I wasn't with the family law firm. There was a nepotism rule. I couldn't be there. But he had a message that he used to give the young lawyers that came to work. He said, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and keep out of politics. And for the first 40 years of my life, I followed that mantra, and I really had no use for politics. Occasionally I would vote, but only occasionally. And then a tragedy struck me and my family. I lost a wife to cancer when she was only 38 years of age. But I had a buddy in Houston who happened to be my tennis doubles partner. He came to me and he said, you know, Bake, he said, you need to do something about your grief. How about helping me run for the Senate? I said, that was Senate in Texas. I said, well, George. I said, that's a great idea, except for two things. Number one, I don't know anything about politics. Number two, I'm a Democrat. And he said, well, we can take care of that latter problem. And when I talk to a room full of Republicans, I say I got religion, but when I'm talking to a mixed group, I say I changed parties. So you can take it. Up here at Harvard, I probably ought to say I changed parties. And I did, and we ran a good race. We lost, but one thing led to another. I found myself up in Washington after that race as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce for President Ford. And then the second tragedy that changed my life struck. His delegate hunter in the race for the Republican nomination in 1976 against Ronald Reagan was killed in an automobile accident. So he had to get a new delegate hunter. And he asked me to come over from Commerce to the campaign and be his delegate hunter. I did that. We barely lost that nomination, went all the way to the convention floor, the way they're speculating the Republican nomination might go this year. Went all the way to the convention floor, and we only won by, I think, 100 delegate votes out of 3,500 votes that were on the floor. That was interesting. I mean, it was sort of exciting, but we won. After the nomination, President Ford asked me, his campaign chairman, Rogers Morton, the Interior Secretary, had gotten cancer. So he asked me to become his national chairman against Jimmy Carter, which I did. We started out 25 points behind. On election day, the two candidates were dead even. We lost that election by 10,000 votes out of 81 million votes that were cast. You turned 10,000 votes around in Ohio and Hawaii, and Ford would have been elected and Carter would never have been president. Well, that really was interesting, too. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, as I realized we were going to lose that election so very narrowly, I said to myself, boy, is this bizarre. 7 years ago, you were a Democratic lawyer in Houston, Texas, and now you have run a presidential campaign for a Republican president, an incumbent Republican president, in what is clearly going to be the closest presidential election of your lifetime. Well, if any of you followed what happened in 2000 in the state of Florida, you know it wasn't the closest presidential election ever. Anyway, by then I was really bitten with a bug. I moved back to Texas. I thought to myself, you know, you've practiced law for 18 years. You need to do something different. You're interested in politics now. So I filed a run for statewide office in Texas. And in those days, Texas was every bit as Democratic as it is Republican today. We had only elected one Republican statewide in Texas since Reconstruction. That was John Tower in a special election where he ran against 3 Democrats. So nevertheless, I got out there and I was flying all over that great big state, and I never will forget one hot afternoon somewhere up in the Panhandle in Texas. I see some people standing at a shopping center, and I go over to give them some campaign literature, and I stick out my hand to introduce myself to this guy, and before I can say a word, he looks at me and he says, "Say, did anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker?" Remember now, I had gotten a lot of national television time as Ford's national chairman. So he recognized the face. I said, "Yes, sir." I swelled up with pride. I said, "Yes, sir, often, often." He never batted an eyelash. He looked right at me. He said, "Doesn't it piss you off?" Well, that's the first clue I had. I wasn't going to win that race. And it was fortunate. It was fortunate for me that I didn't, or I would never have had a chance to come up to Washington. They've asked me to say a few words about negotiation, and I was just telling Jim at dinner, there's a hell of a lot of people out there a lot more expert at negotiation than I am. I was just lucky. I came along. I tell people how lucky I was to be Secretary of State when I was, because we were at the zenith of our power. The Cold War had ended. We were the only remaining superpower. Everybody wanted to get close to the United States of America, and that opened up some space for us to do some very good things. But I want to say a word or two before I talk about negotiation, about how I see the changing role of our country today on the world stage. And there's a lot of talk about this. We are clearly no longer in the unipolar moment that we were when I was Secretary of State. I think that unipolar moment ended on September 11. I'm very proud of some of the things we were able to do, President George H.W. Bush and I were able to do. One of the things we didn't talk about today, Nick, was ending the wars in Central America. I tell people the first negotiation I had as Secretary of State was not with a foreign power. It was with the Congress of the United States. Because the wars in Central America were the holy grail of the far left in this country and the far right in this country. And when we came into office, I remember sitting down with President Bush and saying, Mr. President, you know, if we could take the wars in Central America out of the domestic political debate, the foreign policy problems would probably solve themselves. And they did. We ended up negotiating. I negotiated a bipartisan accord on Central America with the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate. And then we were able to achieve peace in El Salvador and Nicaragua. We did Central America. We did, of course, a peaceful end to the Cold War. We talked a lot today about the reunification of Germany. We had the good fortune of bringing Israel and all of her Arab neighbors to the table face to face for the first time ever to talk peace at Madrid. And then, of course, we had that unprecedented international coalition that we were able to cobble together to reverse an egregious wrong when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And for the next decades, we were really at the pinnacle of our power. Soviet Union was gone. China, at that time, were still only potential superpowers, countries like China and India. We had not yet had to face the insidious threat of radical Islamic fundamentalism. Now, of course, we're beyond that unipolar moment, and we're quite beyond it now. We sit here today. 9/11 revealed our vulnerability to a handful of extremists. We sit here today still suffering to some extent from the worst economic downturn in many, many years, probably since the Great Depression. People ask me what is the most important foreign policy problem facing the United States today, and I say it's the economy, and the economy in that order. Because if we don't re-strengthen our economy, if we don't take care of our debt bomb, we're not going to be able to continue to do the things around the world that we've been able to do in the past. You can't be strong politically and diplomatically when you're weak, or militarily when you're weak economically. We've got to do something about this debt bomb. Having said all that, I really have to tell you, I'm not a declinist when it comes to looking at the future of the United States. With that one caveat, we must get our economic house in order. Getting it in order is difficult today because we're not only economically dysfunctional, we are politically dysfunctional. We got to cure that. We got to get back to the way it was when I was in Washington with Jerry Ford and Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, where we'd reach across the aisle and we'd get things done. And compromise was not a dirty word. And we need to get back to that. And I really feel, ladies and gentlemen, that the day will come when we will get back to that. We still have extraordinary power. We're the only country in the world that can responsibly project power across oceans and continents. We have the strongest, obviously, and most capable military in the world. We have a broad array of formal and informal alliances that permit us to do things diplomatically that other countries can't have a lot of trouble doing. So if we get our debt bomb fixed, if we can come to the point where we don't have a debt to GDP facing us of 100% for the next 5 years, we'll be okay. But we really need to get that done. And I don't know any way to get it done other than one big grand bargain between the parties, but I'm really confident that the day will come when we get there. I hope it will come in the aftermath of the 2012 election. I like the Simpson-Bold Commission's recommendations. I think most of us who want to see that economic problem taken care of like that. I'm very disappointed that President Obama, having appointed the commission, didn't then buy into the results. I also think we need to, I think we need to restore comity to our political system, but I also think we need to be very careful about embarking upon any more costly and open-ended conflicts that drain our national resources. I think that in addition to the economic problem, we're faced with, we got to be careful about financial overreach and strategic overreach. I deplore the fact that there are many in my party today who they haven't found a war that they didn't like, and I don't like. I mean, I don't like it because I was in the Marine Corps and I know what can happen. And that's not to say that you don't stand up forcefully for your national interests. You do, but I would submit to you that the way that President George Bush 41 fought that first Gulf War is a textbook case in the way you ought to fight a war. Get in there, tell everybody what you're going to do, get in there, do it, and then get everybody else to pay for it. Thank you. And that's what we did, isn't it, Minister? You know, I remember back, when I said I'm not a declinist about our future, I think back to when I was Treasury Secretary, when everybody said Japan Inc. was going to take over the world. You remember they were buying up Radio City Music Hall or NBC or whatever it was. I remember all that. They were beating up on us. You guys don't know what you're doing. Japan is going to take over. Well, we all know what happened to that prediction. And I think the United States should probably be the world's preeminent power for years to come, provided we take care of that debt bomb. People think we're in decline because they look at China and India and Brazil, some of the BRICS, and they say, look, America's in decline. I don't buy that. I think those countries are moving up. I don't think it's because America is declining. Why are they moving up? They're moving up because they're embracing our economic system, the free market. And that's something we ought to be glad about, because that's going to give us more and more economic growth opportunities. So we should welcome the rise of those economies. And I think that we will continue to have to rely on our ability to build coalitions, like the coalition that fought the first Gulf War. And that's, of course, a matter that's closely related to your subject of negotiation. We're going to need to be smart. We're going to need to be nimble. We're going to need, above all else, to be able to negotiate well. We need to have that skill as a national asset. You look at China today. Some people think it's written in stone that China and the United States are going to end up fighting each other. I don't believe that. We have a community of interest with China. There are a lot of things where where China's interests and our interests coincide in energy and in regional stability and the war against terrorism and a whole host of other areas. Yeah, we got tensions. We got tensions in Tibet and Taiwan and currencies and trade deficits and so forth. My view on that is we need to negotiate with the Chinese. We need to talk to them all the time. We need to emphasize those areas where we can cooperate and manage the differences between us. And that ought to be, and I think that's the approach we ought to take to China, and that's the approach that this administration is taking. And I certainly support that. We have to address global terrorism. Unfortunately, global terrorism, in my view, is here to stay for the foreseeable future. We ought to all understand and recognize that what happened in Washington and New York on 9/11 could just as easily happen in Tokyo and London or Rio de Janeiro. And the fact that it might gives us an opportunity to build those coalitions and an opportunity to work with those countries. You know, we were talking at our table earlier, Iran worked with us when we first went into Afghanistan, where we'd been hit from. Iran had an interest at that time in not seeing an unstable Afghanistan. I was interviewed the other night by Charlie Rose, and one of the things, he said, what should we do about Afghanistan? I said, well, one thing we ought to try at some point is to get Iran, China, India, Pakistan, Russia, all together and say, hey, now look, we all have an interest in not seeing an Afghanistan from which terror can be used against all of us. So let's all get together, much as we did when we liberated Kuwait. Let's get together and do something about this. We got 110,000 pairs of boots on the ground there. How many pairs of boots do you have on the ground? They don't have any. And yet they've got every bit as big an interest in seeing something good work out there as we do. I happen to think that most successful negotiations come about as a consequence of experience on the part of negotiators. I think having experience is really important. I've said to people, I wrote in my book, that I think my years of practicing law as a commercial attorney and doing mergers and acquisitions set me up pretty good to be a negotiator, because you had to do the same principles that apply in negotiating for your country, apply in negotiating for your client. So I think that's something that was very, very important to me. And then I believe that my political experience was very important to me in learning how to negotiate. I never took any negotiating courses, but I was thrust into it, so I learned from experience. I also tell people that if I told them this before I took office, they would have been horrified, but I'm the only Treasury Secretary in history who never took an economics course. But guess what? Guess what? We reformed the tax code. We lowered the top marginal rate from 70% to 50% first, and then to 28%. And Ronald Reagan stuck it to the Republicans in the House. He was courageous. He rode over his House Republicans so that we could reform the tax code, and we did it with Democratic votes. And that's the kind of thing we need to get back to. We need to start looking at what's good for the country and not what is good for politics. George Bush taught me, 41, that there are two kinds of politicians. One of them, he said, is like the Dalmatian who grows up in the firehouse. Every time the bell rings, he goes and hops on the truck. And from the time he's a puppy, he goes and runs and hops on the truck. Well, that's what a lot of our politicians do. They go to law school, they get out and they run for the legislature, okay? And some of them are very successful. I don't mean to be demeaning anybody who does that, but I think it's better sometimes if you have some real world experience before you become a perpetual professional politician. And he and I did that. We both served in the military, and then we built careers. He formed a successful oil company before he ran for Congress in the 60s. And of course, we've talked about the fact that I worked as a lawyer. So when I speak to young people who are interested in politics, I encourage them to get into it the way we got into it. In other words, get a life before you get into, get a job. Get a job, hold down a job. That's why I'm so high on Mitt Romney. He's been in the private sector. He's run a business. He saved the Olympics. You know, it's always tough to defeat an incumbent president, unless you got a third-party candidate like Ross Perot out there, right? But it's tough. But Romney, in my view, is going to make a very fine general election candidate, because he alone among the Republican candidates might have the ability to appeal to the independent voters in the swing states. And that's where you win general elections, the independent voters in those swing states. So bottom line, I think if you're going to do politics, and there's a lot of good experience that come from that, first of all, get out there in the private sector and earn a paycheck and learn how the free market works. Along the way, I found that there are about a half a dozen building blocks that when properly applied through solid preparation and hard work, and we talked about the 5 Ps today. That was the mantra my father instilled in me. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. And I've lived by that silly little motto all my life. And I've found that it pays off. And I've tried to instill that in my kids and grandkids. Some people say 6 Ps, but we're in delightful company today, and I'm not sure I'm going to go there. I won't go there. But I think there are about a half a dozen building blocks that can be used to develop good negotiating skills. This is not going to come as any surprise to all of you here who are far more expert in negotiation than I am. But first and foremost among them is the ability to understand your opponent's position. You got to be able to know when you sit down at the table what the political constraints are that are facing your interlocutor. That's one of the most important things. The ability to crawl into the other guy's shoes is extraordinarily important. If you can understand that, you got a much better chance of reaching a successful conclusion. And that means paying attention to how he or she views issues and appreciating the constraints that they face. That sure was important to me when we confronted the unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, nobody saw the collapse of the wall coming quite as quickly as it did. We knew things were you know, the Hungarians had opened their border maybe a month or so before. We sure as hell didn't see the implosion of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would break up into 14 different countries or 13 different countries. No great power wants to see itself humiliated. No great power wants to relinquish its supremacy on the world stage. So George Bush 41 was sage enough to know that when all this happened, we weren't to poke it in the eye of the Soviet Union. And by the way, not doing that really paid off when we needed them not to veto the UN resolution to liberate Kuwait. We didn't stick it to him. Bush 1 got criticized up one side and down the other. What's wrong with you? Don't you understand? We've won the Cold War. Can't you show a little emotion? And President Bush said, look, I'm not going to dance on the wall. I'm not going to dance on the ruins of the Berlin Wall. We still got a lot we got to do, with a lot of business to do with the Soviet Union. And I think that our attention to Moscow's sensitivities played a big role in the fact that the Cold War ended peacefully rather than with a bang. The second thing I would mention is building trust through personal relationships. I mentioned this today in the panel. If you can establish a relationship of trust with your interlocutor, you got a hell of a lot closer. You got a whole lot better chance of getting there. That doesn't mean you shave your country's interests at all. Doesn't mean you modify your principal positions. You don't give up on those. But if you can look at the guy across the table, and you have to test him. You don't just get there by taking one look at him. You test him. If he doesn't leak on you to the press, that's one good indication. If he keeps his commitments, if he doesn't say anything that then he doesn't follow through on or break his word to you, that's the kind of trust I'm talking about. And I developed that kind of trust with Eduard Shevardnadze, who had been a Soviet apparatchik for a long time, but he was worried about his country. He's a Georgian by birth, but he was worried about the Soviet Union, and he knew the scope and extent of their problems, and he shared those things with me. I never will forget May of 1989, going to a conventional arms reduction meeting where I visited with him, and I came back and I told the president, I said, you know, he's told me the most amazing things about what the problems are in the Soviet Union. And I really think we can do business with these guys. And we tested him further. President Bush tested Gorbachev on a number of occasions, came to the conclusion that he could trust him. When both sides trust each other in their personal relationships, even the most contentious talks can succeed, because that permits you to then explore territory outside of your formal negotiating positions. You're more relaxed. You're willing to open up, and they're willing to open up. You can talk about your assumptions and your strategies and even your fears without fear that it's going to prejudice your position. Doesn't guarantee success, but it sure as hell improves the odds. Most big negotiations are really nothing more than a series of small negotiations. All the ones we discussed today, Madrid, liberation of Kuwait, unification of Germany, those were all, they all culminated in good results, but there were a lot of small negotiations along the way. Building a coalition and maintaining it. Maintaining a coalition is every bit as tough usually as building it. I find it was always important to start with an issue that could be resolved quickly and reasonably and amicably. A lot of people say, yeah, the shape of the table. Well, you have a lot of debate about the shape of the table. If you can resolve the shape of the table debate, you then have a chance of succeeding. That helps develop a dialogue, which is one of the most important aspects of negotiations. We used to have an arms control negotiator in the Reagan administration named Max Kampelman. And Max had it right. He said, you know, a dialogue is more than two monologues. It's different. It's different. And once you get to the point with your interlocutor that you got a dialogue going, you got a lot better chance. The longer you can keep everybody talking to one another instead of sermonizing at each other, the better are your chances. Okay, the third building block that I call parallel reciprocal confidence building. That's just a method of confidence building that really keeps the parties talking. I recall back in 1991 when I was trying to get Israel and her Arab neighbors to meet in Madrid, I would ask the two sides to consider modest confidence building measures. Once they learned to take small steps in unison, they could move to larger and larger ones, and it worked. And we had to give we had to give letters of guarantee to each of the countries that came to the Madrid peace talk, that we wouldn't change our positions, that we would do this or that or the other. But when we could get one of them to do something for the other side, and get the other side to respond with a little, maybe a tiny little stuff, that helped a lot. Another building block that I learned, I think, is through personal experience, is pragmatism. I served from 1981 to 1985 as President Reagan's chief of staff, his first White House chief of staff. Those were the years when we reduced tax rates significantly, cut some spending, did a lot of deregulation, and built up, had a huge defense buildup. Peace through strength, he called it when we were campaigning. And we did Social Security reform, the so-called third rail of American politics. How did we do Social Security reform without getting burned? Well, we did it by getting the leadership of both political parties together, taking it out of the political debate. Both of them were going to be equally guilty if we reached an agreement, and neither one could blame the other. We met in secret at my house on Foxhall Road in Washington, D.C., and the press didn't know about it till we reached a deal. And that helps too, by the way, if you can keep those negotiations secret, any negotiation secret. But I think that pragmatism is an important part of anything, and most people didn't realize this about President Reagan. They thought he was a shoot-from-the-hip grade B actor who was a hardline ideologue who would never compromise. Shoot, he knew how to get things done. He was one of the best negotiators I've ever known. He'd been the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he had to do a lot of stuff in negotiation in that capacity. He really knew when to hold them and when to fold them. And you know, what I love is that nobody ever called a Gipper unprincipled. Everybody said this guy's hard line, and so when he'd compromise or he understood we judge our presidents by what they can get accomplished, and he was very willing to do whatever it required to get not to give up a majority of what he wanted, but he would shave here and there. And he, you know, many times I'd be sitting there in the Oval, and we'd be debating, talking about what we ought to do on a matter up on the Hill. Should we compromise on this? Or they said, Jim, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with my flag flying. Most people don't remember that about Ronald Reagan. In other words, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Another building block, I think, is timing. We talked about timing today. Timing and sequencing are really important. They're both the same thing, I guess. Recognizing when you need to press a point and when you need to maybe withdraw. I said today in the panel discussion something else. If you're going to be successful in negotiation, you need to be able and willing to walk away from the table if you have to. If the other guy is not somebody you can't trust or is not coming your way at all, you need to say fine and shut your folder and walk away. And I did that. I did that on 2 or 3 occasions. I did it a number of times in the Madrid Peace Conference negotiations. I mentioned today in the panel that one reason we were able to get home on Madrid Conference was because we had defeated Arab rejectionism in the Gulf when we kicked Iraq out of Kuwait. That gave us great credibility with our Arab friends in the region and with Israel. And therefore, we were able to use that to, so timing is another issue that is very, very important. And I would say the 6th and final building block that I would cite to you tonight, there are probably others, but these are just the ones that occurred to me, is a deep respect for politics properly understood. In my memoir, in my diplomatic memoir, I said diplomacy is the continuation of politics, whether in revolution, war, or peace. And in a broader sense, I think democracy itself, of course, is a product of politics. That's why it doesn't make sense when people say, I really admire the American system of government, but I detest the politics. What are they talking about? They are inextricably linked. You know, they're roots and branches of the same tree. And by politics here, I'm talking about 2 things. One is, of course, the art and science of winning elections. It's hard to argue with what Senator Fulbright said when he said, you know, to be a statesman, you got to first get elected. And it's true. That's how our system permits people to put their policies into practice, put their philosophy, to convert their philosophy into policy. Politics, in the second sense, is what occurs between elections. And that, of course, is the process of turning ideas into policies. In other words, it's governing. And it's only through this politics in this second sense that we can transform philosophy into policy. An elected official can only do that to the extent that he has power. And power in our system ultimately derives from public support. That's why I said today in one of the panels that, you know, when you're formulating and implementing foreign policy, you got to have principles and values involved, but you also got to have the national interest involved. Because if you don't have a substantial national interest involved, sooner or later, when the body bags start coming home, you're going to lose the support of the American people. And you can't sustain the policy once you lose the support of the American people. A public official who loses public confidence obviously loses power. A public official who understands and husbands that resource and uses it wisely really can change the course and the direction of history. My point, I guess, simply is this: politics enters into every policy decision that a president or other public official makes. That is not bad. That is not only necessary, it's good. That approach helped us build that Gulf War coalition. Effective U.S. leadership at that time depended on our ability to persuade others to join with us. We were lucky the way it all began. I was in Siberia negotiating arms control with the Soviet foreign minister. President Bush was in Aspen meeting with the UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Saddam Hussein was an expert at picking the bad time to do things, and this was a really bad time because it enabled us, and as a consequence of the fact that Shevardnadze was misinformed by his bureaucracy with respect to Iraq's intentions, he was so embarrassed that he agreed to stand shoulder to shoulder with me in an airport in Moscow as I flew home from Asia and condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and he did that without ever clearing it with Gorbachev. And that, had that not happened, we might never have been able to get that resolution authorizing the use of force. Let me conclude by saying, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here and a pleasure to receive this award, which I consider to be a very prestigious award. I did a little math the other day, and I discovered that I've been alive for about a third of the existence of the United States. Now, I don't know whether that shows you how old I am or how young this country is, but age does give me, I hope, a reasonably broad perspective on the history of our great country. I'm old enough to have seen us pass through social revolutions, economic downturns, military setbacks, and political crises. And if I've learned one thing in my almost 82 years now, it is this: never, 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 never bet against Uncle Whiskers. Because if you do, you're going to lose. Thank you very, very much.